I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Cecilia Edwards is a partner in Everest Group's consulting practice. With 20 years of experience in strategy and management consulting, Cecilia has worked with a number of Fortune 500 companies, middle market companies, private equity firms, and nonprofit organizations. She brings this strategic expertise to Everest Group's clients with a focus in next generation IT strategies, enterprise as a service models, IT-enabled business transformation, and service provider growth strategies. Michael Hedegaard, also a partner in the consulting practice, focuses on services strategy and execution for consumers, enablers, and provider of services. His work has spanned multiple industries, including banking, financial services, healthcare, hospitality and travel, informational technology, insurance, retail, and utilities. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Cecilia. Take it away.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So happy to have you here today. For those of you who've joined us on a few of our other webinars, welcome back. For those of you who it's the first time joining, welcome. As soon as we get to the next slide, we're going to just kind of start. I think that a lot of us in this COVID-19 shutdown crisis have started home gardens. I know we jumped on the bandwagon about a week ago with our raised bed garden and planted our first batch of vegetables. And so I think it's fitting to set the context for what we're going to talk about today using a quote from Liberty Bailey, who, if you're in this horticulture world, is a renowned horticulturalist. And I think that while he was speaking about gardens, I think the lesson of this quote is very much applicable to enterprises today as we're kind of coming through this crisis together. So he talks about a recovering enterprise requires patience, labor, and attention. Enterprises don't grow merely to satisfy ambitions or to fulfill good intentions. They thrive because someone expended effort on them. And so today's webinar is really talking about smart ways to expend effort. As we think about those gardens, we know that you can't just throw whatever in and just kind of hope that it grows. You actually have to be thoughtful about it, and you have to be strategic to figure out how you're going to navigate and what to get to the outcome that you want. And so we have really labeled our whole conversation around things that you can do to come through as we start to reopen our economy, to kind of come through this phase. We really talk about smart recovery. And so from a smart recovery perspective, there are kind of three things that we are looking at. The first one is smart savings. Right, this is the one that everybody really thinks about. And when we say smart, it really is, you have to figure out how to absorb some of the impact from lockdowns. Cost savings alone is unlikely to restore anybody to kind of full status of financial impact that they may have taken during this recovery, but you should expect to get some of the impact absorbed there. It should actually fund any transformation that's required during the recovery, and help you emerge with a cost competitive positioning. So that's what we are labeling as smart savings. The second smart strategy is smart agility. And we think about what that means. It's the ability to respond to changes in customer behavior, demand, and based on what's going on with your competitors. If there's anything that this time period that we're certain of, is the amount of uncertainty that's happening. Everybody's having conversations about what the new normal is going to be. We're opening up at the same time some folks are closing down again. We know that things are going to be different. So this idea of being able to respond to all of those changes in the marketplace is really what we're talking about from a smart agility perspective. And then thirdly, it's smart resilience. Resilience meaning I have to figure out how to open back up after this shutdown, but what happens if there's another one? What happens if things don't return to the way we think? What if some other disruption happens in business? So these are kind of three concepts that we're going to step through each one of those in today's webinar and go into those a little more deeply. So the first one we're going to start with is smart savings. So, but before we do that, we got a question for you. Want everybody to give us a little bit of feedback. There's a question that really to understand what cost reduction strategies has your company deployed over the last 3 months, right? So there's a number of things that we could see. There's budget reductions, there's taking measures to reserve cash, there's anything to stop investments, eliminate your low priority discretionary spending, or making some investments that will have longer term benefit on your cost position. So if you could take a moment and select kind of all of the answers that apply to your company, and we'll kind of give that a few more minutes. Not a few more minutes, give it a little bit for folks to answer. So I see lots of good feedback coming in. Okay, just give a couple more folks a chance. All right, great. So I think we can go ahead and show the results of that. So interestingly, measures to reserve short-term cash, 83%. Obviously, cash is king, right? And so the other one that you see that's high is the low priority discretionary spending, which is sort of another flavor of that cost preservation. The interesting one is nobody did the reduce all budgets equally. We're going to talk about that in a minute. That's actually great to see. Michael, anything stand out to you on these?
The last one there, investing in initiatives to lower long-term cost positions. I would have had expectations that was a little bit higher. You know, certainly most of the time a good idea, but with the thought that this may sustain for a while, I would have thought more companies would have been looking there.
Yeah, great. So let's jump back into the discussion to talk about smart cost reduction, if we could. And I think that, you know, the idea here, to torture our gardening analogy through the rest of this session, is if you think about pruning, right? When you have a garden and you're pruning, the intention there is actually to strengthen the plant. Nobody actually takes a pair of shears out intentionally to kill the plant, to thwart its ability to thrive and grow. And so that's the same thing that we have from a smart savings perspective. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to kind of take us through some of the discussion on this smart savings.
Sure. When I think about smart savings, I think about my tips for better summer tomatoes. So I'll start with that as an analogy. No, I'm just kidding. We'll leave the analogy off the slide. When we think about the response to these downturns, you know, there's two major levers. A lot of people take defensive cost cutting, and you know that kind of was that first option almost across the board. Let's figure out ways to get costs down in the organization immediately. Really not taking a lot of careful thought to it, but just the lower the cost base now, the better we'll emerge on the other side of the financial downturn. Others find themselves maybe flush with cash, but you know, don't have as much operating needs as they did in the past. You know, it's just a lull, but they still have money to invest, and they start investing heavily to emerge with a competitive position. What we find is neither one of those maximizing both either lever is the right way to do. Often the investment purely in you know, an advantage, often when you emerge as a short-term advantage, where when you defensive cutting costs, while it might get you in a better cost position, really doesn't make you competitive on the other side. So really it's rather taking a balanced approach to cost cutting things that really will give you systemic or sustainable advantage, as well as investment on the other side that makes you better suited for the world as we emerge.
Yes, I think that's why it was good news when we looked at that poll question that none of our attendees actually selected that there's kind of across the board budget cuts, which would be an example of that defensive cost cutting.
Exactly. So as we look into the next, there's a bunch of levers that you can play with here. We talked about budget cuts already, but there's other things. Certainly in our daily lives, we've seen examples of staff utilization. Doctors who really have patients for elective surgeries that don't want to come to the hospital, we've seen them move to telemedicine, or I had my last doctor's appointment over Zoom. We've seen retail clerks turn into fulfillment on the online channel. So moving, the brick employees, if you will, into much more of a click delivery mechanism. We need to think about what opportunities we have in our services organization to do that. We probably are seeing a shift in demand for our back office services, and those that have spikes, we need to look at where we have lulls and opportunity to do cross training or kind of change the role temporarily. Keep those employees engaged, or maybe they have less demand for their pre-COVID pandemic job, so that we have them ready when the demand does come back. Some ideas are taking sales associates that maybe were an in-person role and changing them into maybe a social media advocate for the brand, right? Or a social media ambassador. There are several examples we can think about in the back office function. You just need to, I think about it differently.
Yeah, Michael, I think you even have examples of one of the clients that you're working with that had a higher call center requirement, and they just pulled people from corporate and said everybody's now a call center agent.
Exactly. It's almost like in the airlines in times of trouble, they pull people onto the phones to make sure that the weather event or the pandemic kind of gets resolved. Absolutely, that's a great opportunity example, Cecilia. The next lever on productivity, it really depends on the industry that you're in. I think that some industries, they saw a halt in business or a very extreme kind of slowdown in business. We saw others that had their businesses ramp up in a way that wasn't maybe anticipated. Most of us probably saw a shift in demand, right? It's the way we were doing business before fundamentally is coming through different channels now. So when you think about the productivity layer, it kind of depends on where your business or your industry is, figuring out how best to pull the productivity lever. If your demand for your services have gone down, you have a lot of subject matter experts that might be able to accelerate your automation agenda. If you have a spike in demand, you might be able to use the same automation tools to help accommodate that spike and get better productivity out of your current process. I don't know, Cecilia, any other examples come to bear for you thinking about productivity?
Yeah, I think that those are all good ones, and I think some of the automation types of things play into that as well.
Right, and one that we here at Everest Group have been hearing a lot about is the last one, number 4. Service provider relationships have evolved and changed, and they are a source of value. And not all that value is in temporary cost reductions or a shift in payment terms. While those are popular and necessary for some buyers to go concede, but we might need to shift scope in a way that because of these shifting channel demands. And really, I think the note there is going in with an interest-based approach with your service provider. Hopefully you have a good relationship with them, and you'll have more of a partner like discussion of, my needs are changing or my business reality is different. The context has fundamentally changed. Let's look at how we can both benefit from adjusting the way that we work together commercially, scope-wise, process-wise. And I think that that's a really easy way to extract value for both partners.
Yeah, and so obviously with us being Everest Group, doing a lot of sourcing work, why don't we dig into that one just a little bit more on the next slide.
Sure. So we've put, 4 kind of things to think about. Certainly, there's an opportunity for some of us to update our terms and conditions with our service provider. We're pretty good at anticipating or basing our expectations of the next crisis based on the most recent one we went through. So I really think there's going to be a lot of what if this happens next time? How was I poorly positioned now with my partner that we need to better position ourselves in the future? I think the next
Michael,
one.
on that one, you talk about partner, but sometimes we've got a vendor relationship, right? And so the T's and C's may need to change to establish more of that partner relationship that you mentioned before.
Exactly. It could be an opportunity to benchmark pricing. Another way to think about that is audit of the service billings. These often service relationships get very complicated, and billing is something that kind of moves on and kind of separates from the actual services. There's every once in a while, it's a good time to look at price benchmarking or maybe even auditing the invoices to make sure that everything is still aligned with the original intent and with the documented agreement that you have in place. I think obviously there's a time to eliminate waste when we're talking about shifting channels of the demand for your services is coming in differently. As you're having to think about your services organization, you really need to include your service provider in that conversation and figure out ways to rebalance, maybe again, move scope around, move demand around, and eliminate that waste.
And even things like overbuying of licenses and things like that are good examples on that waste piece as well.
Exactly. And our demand is likely fundamentally changing for a lot of us. Again, back to depends on what industry you're in, the way that your services organization might be seeing this. But how do you balance those demand fluctuations or plan and build for them in the future with your service provider? Maybe this was an unanticipated event when you built your agreement. It's now time to build in the anticipation of potentially another similar event and make sure that you have the resilient agreement to go through the next one. Right?
So perfect. So now we're going to talk about our second element, smart agility. And here, just again, the picture, these are mangroves. And if you know anything about how their roots grow, they grow around whatever obstacle is presented to them. So when you look at this picture, it's going to look very different in terms of where the roots are, what the structure is, what it looks like, depending upon if there's boulders or water or just kind of whatever. So every picture of mangroves is going to look very different. So from a smart agility perspective, they're adapting. And what we're thinking about here is adapting to the shifts in the environment in order to thrive. So we'll talk about kind of the goal from an agility perspective. Quickly respond to a fast changing market condition. So obviously everyone wants to respond quickly. The reason we think this is important from a recovery perspective is I just mentioned before that the amount of uncertainty in the marketplace is rampant. There's uncertainty not only within your organization, your competitors are uncertain about where things are going. Customers are not really clear about what their preferences are going to be and where things are headed. So there's a lot of uncertainty and it's going to change pretty quickly. And so when we think about that, customers, I mean, we're still trying to figure out what does touchless engagement look like? How long do I need it? Boy, we used to think that digital channels were for the millennials, right? Digital channels are for everybody right now. Everybody's doing telemedicine visits and ordering things online. You just have no choice. So the extreme demand for digital channels, and then product demand shifts. Listening to the news this morning, and they're talking about where different industries are, and the apparel industry is trying to figure out how in the world do they actually think about the demand because what do people need in terms of clothing right now, and when do they need it, and you know how that shifts when everybody's staying at home, right? So there's all kinds of things like that from a customer expectation perspective.
Yeah,
If
and
you
Cecilia, I think that all those kind of B2C examples that we come up with, we need to think about how does that affect our services organizations.
Yes.
Everyone in that B2C world is also our internal customer for our services organization. And their expectations certainly are evolving rapidly, and now we have a huge work at home force more than likely in our organizations. Are our services models keeping up?
Yeah.
We shifted it to that internal customer expectations as well.
That's a great point. And I think we've learned that now from kind of the digital transformation, that it's important for businesses to look at what's happening in the consumer space, because beforehand you say, well, we're dealing with companies, and if I'm a B2B, I'm dealing with a company, so it's very different. But now that we've kind of democratized technology, every single one of those employees, every single one of those business customers is a human being who is experiencing the world as a consumer, and their experiences have been democratized as well. And so absolutely those internal responses need to be mirroring the life that people are experiencing everywhere else. So definitely. Competitive response. What are the product and service changes that are happening in the industry? Again, in the customer engagement models and cost bases. We talked about a retail example briefly earlier. Well, now I have to, or if I'm a grocery store, do I need curbside, or any type of store? Do I need curbside pickups? What does that look like? Do you see the airlines that are kind of going, well, I'll use some bio data in order to give you a touchless onboarding experience, or I have cleaning requirements, right? So there's all kinds of things around the competitive nature. We don't yet understand what the basis of competition is going to be in the new world, and we kind of have to be ready to react as those things start to emerge. We talked about the supply chain, right? On the left-hand side, you think about supply chain or your value chain. Every demand shift that your company is going through, your entire supply chain is having to react to that as well. They've got location constraints just like you do. They have no and low contact operations that they've got to figure out, and you have to do all that securely, right? So how do you even think about reacting to that? And the location piece in particular, because everybody's opening up at different times. In the US, you've got states that are opening at different rates, and then internationally, countries are in different places as they deal with the crisis and opening and closing. And so as you think about these kind of global value chains, I think everybody's impacted differently, and the impact on all of the different players can vary considerably. And it's full of uncertainty. So you got to be able to respond to that. And then lastly, the one at the bottom is the government and public health guidance. What if businesses shut down, right? Florida opened. Florida's shutting some things down. Trump has said that he doesn't intend to shut the country down should there be a second wave, but the local jurisdictions have a little bit of say about that as well. And you kind of see this ebbing and flowing, even in our office building. Michael and I both office in Dallas. So our office building opened back up. So you have an option to go in, but we just got an email yesterday that there were 2 cases in the building adjacent to ours. They're cleaning everything down. And so, maybe people that worked in that building can't come into the office again, right? So all of this keeps changing, the social distancing guidelines. And so companies have to figure out how to react and respond to all of those things. And that requires a significant amount of agility. So just like we had on the call. Go ahead, Michael.
It's a dynamic situation. Just here in the state of Texas, we have 3 of our 4 largest cities. The mayors are arguing with the governor about what they can and cannot do. I actually think while we're talking, our city council here in Dallas is debating the mask ordinance, which would be in direct conflict, I think, with Governor Abbott. So it's going to be very dynamic. I think for the time forward, we have states going in different directions on hospitalizations It's going to continue to be dynamic, I think, for a foreseeable future.
Yeah, and the challenge for business is you got to do business in the middle of that, right? So agility, kind of understanding. So it's not the excuses are gone, right? It's just understanding what really is happening, and then how do you do business. So just like we did in the savings, we've got some levers to think about. So the first one is ensuring your digital engagement capability. When we're talking about low touch and no touch, almost everybody has had to figure out how I'm going to have some level of digital engagement from a sales perspective and from a delivery perspective. We've seen people, businesses have all gone to, if you can, the corporate perspective, the work from home component, that is a digital engagement. You see sales forces who previously were doing face-to-face types of engagement. They've had to become social salespeople and digital ambassadors and things like that in order to do that. And everything from the curbside delivery that we just talked about. That's a digital engagement, and we have to, and everybody has had to shift to thinking about how whatever my product or service is, how do I allow a response digitally? Even how you get your pizza, right? You kind of, even if it's Domino's delivers, well, then you actually select if I want contactless and how now I can pay and all of those kinds of things. And so really beefing up your ability to engage digitally protects you from any changes in openings and shutdowns, et cetera, because you have a way to continue those engagements regardless of what the environment is doing. Deploying big data and AI. We need to know what the changes are, right? We need to have a good understanding of what's happening, and having access to data is the best thing that we could possibly do. And so the idea is you need the right data sets that give you a sense of what's going on in the market, what's happening from a demand perspective, what can your supply chain handle, where are the bottlenecks, where are the things that need to be changed. You need all of that data. It needs to be data that changes frequently. If the environment is changing on a weekly basis, you can't have monthly data or quarterly data. You need to have a way to get data that's refreshed on a regular basis. And you need to have the analytics capability to draw those insights out, because there's nothing like having lots of data. I mean, if you think about it, we're talking about this COVID-19 crisis. We're testing, hundreds of thousands of people across the world. We should know something about this disease, right? And so that's a pretty big data set, but you have to apply the analytics to make sure you're drawing the right sets of insights. And it's the same thing with your business. If you want to be able to respond rapidly, you need to get an understanding, and using big data and artificial intelligence is a great way to do that.
Yeah, Cecilia, I would say you could almost put another bullet and just change the first letter to redeploy big data. There's a lot of data that we sit on now that we are using for one intended purpose, forecasting demand, for example, in a typical grocery store that you go visit. Now we need to deploy that to tell the online consumer whether or not we have it for curbside pickup, right? The data's there. It just needs to be redeployed in a different way. And I think we can look at our services organizations to ask a similar question of what data do we redeploy in a different way due to the shift in channel demand.
I think that's a great point, Michael. If you think about the Target story that most people know about, the advanced analytics that they would run on their shopping data to determine whether or not someone was pregnant. Because if you capture a mom, you capture the spending of the family. And so they ran some advanced analytics to be able to figure out, how do I tell as early as possible that someone's pregnant? Well, okay, and we know that they had some challenges of spooking people by knowing way too soon. But in this situation, same thing. All of those sales data, that probably with some smart analytics is giving you some good insights in terms of where customers thinking might be headed. Even if as a customer we don't know, right? But an analysis of the data, you could draw some pretty good insights out of that. Okay, our third one is cross-train employees. Michael talked about this a little bit on the cost savings one, and it's worth repeating here from an agility perspective. Silos don't work when you're trying to be flexible in an uncertain environment. You have to have the ability to, today I might be working on one project, but tomorrow I need something else, right? One of the things that we're seeing as companies are trying to respond to things is the services that the business needs are changing. So you might have been working on an IT project, for example, where you were developing on something and you thought it was important, but as your company is looking at what's needed today, they actually need different projects. You need to be able to shift and switch to that project. I'll use the school example. We have, a lot of times people have in-person professors and teachers, and then they have their online community. Well, over this past spring break, when every college and university became an online institution, everybody kind of had to figure out what they were going to do and how they were all going to shift online, right? And so just being able to cross-train people so that you can function wherever and whenever. It's almost taking on that entrepreneurial mindset where in a startup, everybody's kind of chief cook and bottle washer. And it's only when you get to this big enterprise status where you go, this is my job and I'm staying in my lane. Forget the lanes. We all need to become entrepreneurial and be prepared to pitch in wherever or whenever.
Yeah, and Cecilia, I think I may have made this point earlier, but just in case, if you have a group of employees that, maybe they're not as in high in demand for their current job, a good way to make sure that they're there when the demand comes back is to shift them over to in an adjacent area that has a higher spike. Then when things, the demand patterns might normalize a little bit, you don't have to go out, rehire, retrain to push everybody back into the other function that had a lot less demand. So yeah, there's a lot of good reasons to do this, not just, meeting intermittent cycles.
Absolutely. And our last one is build flexibility into your supplier relationships. Again, in the last section when we were talking about costs, Michael mentioned partnerships. We really strongly believe that now is the time to think about your IT and business process service providers as partners and not just vendors. And that means if you're aligning objectives and you're thinking about the variability in your business, they also then have that variability. If you align and build in structurally the flexibility to change scope without needing change orders that take weeks and weeks and weeks, well, boy, I might need something new by the time I finally get the paperwork signed, right? So how do you think about forming those relationships that allow for changes in demand, changes in scope, new technologies, all those types of things that are required to be responsive to whatever's going on in the business environment. So, all right, so I think we're going to move on over to smart resilience now. So kind of ensuring that you can survive the crisis. So the last tortured portion of our metaphor here is the growing conditions aren't always ideal, right? And so you've got a choice. When you're faced with a tough environment, you can either die or you can actually figure out how to grow and thrive through it. And so that is what we're talking about from a resilience perspective. And again, Michael, you'll take this one on for us.
Yeah, so when we think about it, I mean, operate cost effectively. An example that comes to mind is, if you're in an industry that's seeing extreme variability or those shifts like we talked about before, you may think about taking fixed costs and moving them into variable costs. Service providers or relationships with outsourcing partners is a good way to do that. Another way is, converting needed CapEx into OpEx. I know I'm working with a client now that needs a big investment in the analytics space. They can't afford or don't want to lay out the cash for the analytics environment, so rather they're going to consume it from a service provider in an OpEx fashion. Additionally, our customers their needs are changing. both from an end customer of the enterprise point of view, also from the customer of our services organization. And how do we make sure that we're remaining relevant both to the end customer and both to the internal customer within our services organization. We talked about the shifting expectations. They're not going to be as lenient if there's another spike in or another pandemic that comes up. The expectations that they now have at the end of this pandemic is probably where we'll start the next one, right? So at first we allowed, I think, the businesses that we favor to give a little time. We wanted to give them our business. The next time around, they might have expectations that we figured that out. Operating securely, again, this goes back to forgiveness that we might have gotten when this thing snuck up on us, to where we had to shift some in-office or in the service delivery location employees to home office. There was probably some security constraints that were lifted at that time. The next go around, we should have planned for them, and we should be ready to, that it's not a security exception anymore, rather it's part of our security planning, and that we've thought about the next pandemic impact or the next work from home situation.
That's right.
Then we have a group of levers on this as well. Certainly accelerating your digital solutions, I think should help across all three of those levers. And inherently, they are more flexible. They should have security built in, and you should be more resilient to adapt to those customer expectations, and hopefully have a higher retention rate in your customers.
And the folks that we've seen that have fared reasonably well are the folks that have done that, right? We mentioned Domino's. They're really an e-commerce company that sells pizza. We think about Microsoft, right, who already was pretty digital, and their CEO says, you know what, I've had to advance kind of 2 years worth of digital transformation in a span of a few weeks. And I mentioned the colleges and universities who might have been planning to be online, but within the span of a week had to figure out how they were going to be online learning companies in a week's 1 to 2 week time frame. So you see that the folks that have been pretty successful have absolutely done that.
Remote work at scale, I think a lot of us quickly got there without really purposely doing it. But again, the next time around, there will be expectations that we should have anticipated this. And do we have the right tools in place? Do we have the right policies in place? Do we have the right training in place to make sure that we can pivot just as quickly and not miss a beat on remote work at scale with our internal workforce as well as those of our partners?
Yeah, Michael, an interesting one on that is, from a US perspective, we think it was pretty smooth, right? Sort of, right? Everybody's complaining about Zoom and Teams and things like that. But if you think about some other countries, we know that a lot of the companies in India used desktop computers, right? And so when you have a need to go work from home, boy, you now have an infrastructure challenge, because you can't just grab your laptop, throw it in your bag, and be done. You now need to, requisition desktops and things like that. And there was a shortage of laptops in the country, which made it very difficult for them to get there at scale kind of instantaneously. They had to do some Herculean things. They had to consider some people essential, meaning they had to go into the office, all of those kinds of things. And those are some of the nuances about remote working at scale that need to be figured out.
Absolutely, good point. Yeah, the expanded concept of backup, I think, to Cecilia's point, we built an infrastructure for some of our workers that were intended to be in the office. That brings in a whole new thinking that's needed as we are much more flexible in the way we work and the way that we need to make sure we protect that work and where we are.
And I think what's interesting, oftentimes we think of backup as like an extra server somewhere, so we're backing up the computer types of things. If you think about Microsoft supporting the world on their Office platform, one of the things that they thought about from a backup perspective is I gotta have an extra location, right? Our business continuity plans usually think about a location down, like a city or an office, but then you had a country, then you had the globe down. So what do you do when that happens? And then we had single points of failure, right? I'm the expert in this. Well, what if that person gets sick, right? So thinking through geographic, human, as well as technology backups are important as well.
And I think the last one is quite obvious, but when we think about business continuity planning, again, we're not going to get as many excused performance type waivers in the next pandemic. We will need to have a much more robust planning around business continuity. There will be expectations, we believe, if things do happen in a similar way, that you should have thought about this and you should have a plan to execute.
So kind of bringing all three of these levers, kind of smart savings, smart agility, smart resilience together, we've put together a roadmap, a high-level roadmap that help you think through kind of how to map out your recovery. And you'll see those three things kind of woven throughout this roadmap. And really, we think about it in 5 steps. There's a piece around setting your strategic priorities. During an uncertain time period, having a set of clear priorities is important because you've got to focus the organization on the highest priority thing that's happening right now. And so there's no more business as usual. All business activities need to be aligned to a clear set of priorities that have been decided and articulated. And so going through some effort to think through what's the implication on safety, what's the implication on supply chain, market demand, all of those kinds of things, and getting a real clear set of direction allows then it empowers the rest of your workforce to be able to make smart decisions that are in alignment. So they have to make smart and quick decisions that are in alignment with the strategic objectives of the organization today, because we know they'll change tomorrow. The second thing is establishing a recovery kind of journey management team. Because you're going to change, because the environment's going to change, because your strategic priorities are going to change, you have to be a little bit more disciplined, we believe, about how you manage the process through this change piece. You might have decided something a month ago that made really good sense to execute then, and then today it's no longer an issue. We said the environment's going to change. How do you make those decisions? How do you identify the priorities? How do you organize yourselves? How do you keep reshuffling your resources in order to make sure that you're working on the right sets of things? So there's a whole piece around, and how do you figure out where you're going to spend your money? Forgot to mention that one, right? But there's a whole set of things around establishing a very disciplined way to make decisions rapidly to stay in alignment with those objectives. The third one is really setting the contractual terms for both your IT and business process services providers. Michael mentioned a number of these things in terms of terms and conditions and pricing and benchmarking. The idea here is you really need to have the flexibility to treat them as an extended part of your team. They have got to be partners. Otherwise, you just take away so much flexibility and you lose value. You lose an ability to be responsive. Third, reevaluate your services sourcing strategy. And when we say sourcing, that's a combination of what's in-house versus what's outsourced, what the structure of your portfolio is. Sometimes people have made decisions that say, I'm going to let every business unit get their own service provider. So you've got tons of folks doing same type of scope. That might not be the best answer if you need some flexibility to be able to shift, because you don't have to shift 10 providers. It might be easier to shift a few. You might have you may want things aligned vertically instead of horizontally, right? So I might say, gee, I want somebody to own this entire business process and all of the components in my stack and the service, to be able to flex that as opposed to having to coordinate across a lot of service providers. So really rethinking what is the right deployment of all of my team players, of my in-house staff, as well as my service providers. What's the right configuration to make sure that collectively we're able to respond to the needs of the business and the marketplace? And then the location strategy, that's the whole piece that we were just talking about in terms of we may have made location decisions before that were based purely on cost. Let me find the lowest cost location. But if I'm thinking about business continuity in an expanded way, I might need to make some shifts in terms of how I think about that. So that's what's happening in the kind of reevaluation of our sourcing strategy. And finally, you need to figure out the resourcing. It's fine to have all these plans and ideas, but you have to have resourcing to execute any initiatives that come up. That means the people that are dedicated to the transformations, dedicated IT professionals, dedicated business subject matter experts, you have to free them up. So this is when we talk about having that flexibility to shift people. There's the run the business and there's the change the business. During this recovery, there's a lot of change the business. And it might be unreasonable in many instances to expect that an individual will have adequate capacity to do all the running and the changing at the same time. And so you might need to shift resources a little bit so that you free people up to do the important work of change the business. And so that's the same thing on flexibility in your relationships and your funding approach in order to support that. So that's our roadmap that we have. So with that, we're going to just wrap up to talk about some of our key takeaways. So the first one, if we think about going back to the smart savings, is really to focus your savings efforts on those things that are not going to hinder your company's ability to serve your customers, both current and future needs. When we look at agility, you have to ensure that your business processes and your service provider relationships are structured to rapidly respond to the evolving market demands. And then finally, when we think about resilience, you need to take time to shore up any critical weaknesses that have been uncovered during this COVID-19 crisis so far, so that you can be ready the next time. So that ends the content portion. Before we get into our Q&A, I want to let you know of a couple of special offers that are complimentary to everyone that registered. The first one is we have a white paper, the Smart Recovery white paper, kind of IT and business process service priorities for thriving in uncertain times. It covers a lot of what we talked about in the webinar, and it does give you a hard copy of the roadmap that we just went through. And so we'd like to make a copy of that available to everyone. And then in that white paper, we actually give you a link. We've put together our COVID-19 recovery preparedness assessment. This is a rather quick online assessment that you can take that asks you some key things about things that we think are important in that recovery roadmap. You answer those questions, and then we'll come back and give you a sense of how prepared you are for the recovery and some suggestions of things that you might want to consider incorporating into your recovery plan. So I think we'll give you, you can either go to that directly, but if you download the paper, there's a link in there that will take you to that recovery preparedness assessment. And we'll encourage everybody to take advantage of both of those. So I think now we'll open it up for questions. Michael, if you want to cover the logistics, if you'll just kind of remind people of some of that while I check out a couple of the questions here.
Sure. So the functionality within the platform is you can submit your questions to us via text. Those will come through to us, and Cecilia and I will answer as many of them as we can while we're on the session.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So our first question is related to updating of terms and conditions. So it says that we mentioned that one area of shifting from fixed cost to variable. This person is curious if there's been any talk from companies about increasing payment terms to higher net terms so that tier 1 companies can increase their cash flow. Michael, why don't you take that one for us?
Sure. Actually, this is one of the most common and immediate plays that a lot of people took, especially those that were in particularly distressed situations. Maybe they had an unhealthy business going into the shutdown, and that the shutdown just exacerbated. I mean, one that comes to mind is luxury retailers, right? Not only was their supply chain disrupted due to the initial outbreaks of where the virus hit, but also the economic downturn affected their demand. So certainly businesses such as that, I think it's perfectly reasonable to come to their providers and talk about adjusting terms. Now, it's potentially not going to be kind of a flat rate, sure, we'll give you another 90 days, but rather a discussion around, I understand you're having cash flow issues, we can help accommodate that, but in order to, here's some things that I might need for my part of the business. So make sure that you're going into it, one, being interest-based, and two, in a partner-like fashion, that you're trying to make both businesses survive and be kind of above water during the crisis.
Thanks for that. So our second question, kind of a two-parter, but all getting at the same thing. So robotics is a way to solve problems of R&D lab-based work. So it is a way to solve problems. But in such a short span, how do organizations decide if their return on such robotics investments will be good enough? And similarly, kind of a part B, which is related, operational agility. How do companies decide if their temporary workarounds are able to yield the benefits for longer periods of time? So I'll take this one. It's an interesting time period, and one of the things that I talked about a little bit in the agility portion, is the funding. So I kind of halfway skipped over that, but there definitely needs to be a different set of decision making when you're in the middle of a crisis and where you're in the middle of such high times of uncertainty. The evaluation models that we used to use, where you'd say, here's a project, what I'd like to do is build out the business case. It has a multi-year return on investment, and if it has an acceptable ROI, then we'll do it. In the middle of a crisis and the need to respond quickly, you don't have that kind of time. What we need now are things that say, what's it take for me to respond, for me to survive, etc. And I need to make those investments. So as long as things are 100% in alignment with my strategic priorities, I need to execute against those things, because a return on investment when your revenue goes to zero is not a meaningful calculation, right? So these are some things that if it's deemed as strategic imperative, you kind of just need to do it, because the alternative is no revenue, or such low revenue that's crippling to your company. So you have to think about that. The second piece, when you think about the agility and kind of the time horizon, is because things are so uncertain, you actually can't plan for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. What you see, the companies that have been successful have been solving today's problem and solving as much of the future problem as they can foresee. So when we talked about the colleges and universities becoming online institutions, none of those folks built out an e-learning platform. They didn't have time. They said, boy, here's a solution that's out there, and I think it makes good sense. When people said, I need to go to video conferencing, they didn't build out stuff. They're like, I could go Teams, I could go Zooms, I could go Blue Jeans, I could go WebEx, I could go, like they just found existing platforms and said, I'm gonna use those. And so there is this good enough piece that has to come into play. There's this book, Paradox of Choice, which I think is a really great one for lots of folks to read to change the mindset. Sometimes we're looking for the absolute best solution. And in particular, from an IT perspective, that has been the gold standard in the past. I need to make sure that I have a strong, robust, enterprise-grade solution, and those are the only things that I'm going to do. Well, in this environment, enterprise grade, why in the world would I spend 2 and 3 years to invest in something that's enterprise grade that I might only need for a shorter period of time, or is going to change pretty rapidly? So in the Paradox of Choice, they talk about you've got so many choices, you just need the choices good enough to meet the requirements. So I need to look at what my requirements are for right now. If all I know is what I need to do in the next 3 months, Lululemon didn't fix their e-commerce solution for all eternity. They just knew that while my stores are shut down, I happen to have RFID tags on all my inventory, and I happen to have people that work in these stores. So I'm just going to have them come and ship stuff out from the store. Now, what they're going to do once we reopen, who knows? Those people probably are going to still serve the customers, right? So they're going to have to be flexible. And I think our solutions need to follow in that vein as well. So I think that's going to be our last question for today as our time is winding down. And so thank you for your participation. As you see, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to Michael or I. And then stop by and visit our COVID-19 Resource Center. We have a page on our website that has lots of information about COVID-19. We'll be adding more. So most of what was on there before is a lot of the work that we did during this crisis. We will continue to add resources to that as we help people think through this recovery phase as well. So thank you for your time, and I will turn this back over to, I believe, Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you, Cecilia and Michael, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you'll receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback for today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.